Hello, everyone, and welcome to Baltic Spotlight. Today, we'll be discussing Rebooting a Nation, Estonia's rise as a tech powerhouse. Today, we're very happy to see a friend of JBANC and an advocate within our community, Joel Burke. Joel is the author of the recently published titled Rebooting a Nation, The Incredible Rise of Estonia, E-Government, and the Startup Revolution. And you can find this title now on Amazon. Joe previously worked for the government in Estonia as head of business development for the e-Residency program, as well as working on the Hill as a Congressional Innovation Fellow and Artificial Intelligence Fellow. Today, our discussion is going to be centered around the example of Estonia has set in being a model of e-governance, the lessons to be learned, as well as what lies in store for the future of tech and governance. Joel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. Well, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Um, I first kind of want to start at the beginning of your book. You brought up a very important point about Estonia having a standard of living closer to Finland at the eve of the Second World War. And unfortunately, by 1988, after years of Soviet occupation, you cited statistics that the wages had shrunk to 22% of their Finnish counterparts. The vision of Estonia now is clearly much different, being a leader in terms of startups per capita. And you also cited that it ranked first in a 2022 UN e-government survey, largely as a result of 99% of e-government services being digital. With all that being said, how was Estonia able to foster an entrepreneurial spirit after having a command economy under the Soviet occupation?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question and one that I grappled with a lot. And I think there's not just one answer, but there's a couple things that I'll touch on that I think are important. And so one is as you kind of led off this question, it's Estonia has always viewed Finland as kind of this collegial rival or kind of measuring stick that they judge themselves against. And you can imagine this mentality of when kind of going into World War II, you're at basically roughly equal footing, and then after after World War II, after the Soviet occupation and in achieving their re-independence, Estonia is then just ages behind but behind Finland in terms of quality of life and GDP and in basically every economic measurement. And so it did create this kind of mentality that in order to catch up to Finland, Estonia was going to have to do something drastic. And so part of the reason why Estonia was able to digitalize and become a leader in startups is because I think that especially in the early days with like Prime Minister Mark Lahr putting the country through, pretty tough economic shock therapy. I think that was only possible in part because the citizenry was, willing to do what was necessary to try and, kind of leapfrog their current situation to catch back up to Finland. And I'd also mention, proximity to Finland had this other beneficial effect where, during the Soviet occupation, as opposed to the rest of the iron, countries kind of caught behind the Iron Curtain that may not have been as exposed to the Western world because of the physical proximity to Helsinki, rebroadcast of, English language television shows like Dallas and Dynasty, as well as, Radio Free Europe, were able to kind of make their way to Estonia. So many folks were exposed to, yeah, I mean, capitalism the good old-fashioned way with like television ads, as well as, Western media and news. I think it was President Lennart Meri who was able to recognize certain Western journalists and broadcasters by their voices years later after after the country achieved its independence and he was able to travel freely. So I think that exposure as well as that measuring stick were quite important. And then there were some other historical legacies, but I think those are kind of two ones that I'd focus on for now.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing as I started to crack open the chapters in your book was telling the story of the founders of Skype. And it was interesting to me. It seemed like that this Blue Moon team that you describe, starts up in the late 90s, has a couple of, let's say not successful business ventures. But by then, the mid 2000s, the sale of Skype you describe as a game changer in Estonia, being kind of the seed of the startup scene, just kind of you described the seed of Western information filtering to Estonia during the Soviet occupation. Can you discuss a little bit about the impact of Skype on the startup environment in Estonia?
Yeah. I mean it was hugely impactful. So I mean Skype for those of you who remember the product, and it was just kind of deprecated and ended by Microsoft, but the important thing for Estonia was basically that Skype was basically there were a couple of original co-founders, one from Denmark, one from Sweden, and they had linked up with these guys from Blue Moon, so Jan Tallinn, and Adi Heinla, and a few other folks who were kind of Estonian engineers, and they were brought on to build the actual do the actual engineering work to build the product that would become Skype. They had first built Kazaa for these folks, which was kind of like the next iteration of Napster for those of you who are in the generation who remember having to download music legally on online before we got it free on Spotify. The importance of Skype is kind of threefold. So on one hand, you had a company that basically when it was first acquired by eBay, it created a bunch of millionaires in Estonia, and those folks turned around and became kind of the first, venture investors in the next generation of startups that would appear around the country. This is like the Bolt, the TransferWise, the Starship Robotics. Second, you had basically it was almost like a bit of a university. I mean, more practical than a university, but it helped to basically introduce many Estonian engineers and tech folks into, a model tech company and kind of a Western environment at a time when you can imagine much of Europe in general didn't have that exposure to Silicon Valley, to London, to the rest of the world, and they saw how to build a world-class tech company. But I think probably more important than that was the change in the mentality that it derived in the idea that, like, these guys that people knew from Estonia who had been, creating video games some years before and were just like normal kids that were engineers and tinkering could build, a multi-billion-dollar business from Estonia. And it kind of, it helped make that something that was very tangible for people, as well as, made it a cool thing to do. I think you can, it's a little bit funny. I don't know, how many people on the call, like, for at least for me, having worked in tech most of my career, I trying to explain to my parents what I do. They're quite often like, some depending on the job I had, they kind of get it. But you can imagine if you were a kid in, the early 2000s in Estonia, your parents grew up during Soviet occupation. They have known nothing but basically economic hardship. Many of them were probably like wanted their kids to be doctors and lawyers and like consultants and, these steady, well-paid, high regarded jobs. Whereas you can imagine after the sale of Skype, and because it's such a small country, and many millionaires being created, and all of a sudden it became okay for, talented young people to say, like, I'm going to go build a startup. And in fact, it became, a cool thing to do. So a bunch of talent then kind of flowed into that ecosystem, which had compounding returns.
And was the reason for this ecosystem emerging was the belief to reinvest in the country where basically the founders were from? Like there was the belief in the talent as well as a kind of nationalism that existed as opposed to taking the money elsewhere.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, yeah, these guys could have, gone off to the south of France or something, or bought sports teams or whatever. But I think it was Sten Tomkevi, who was one of the early Skype employees and is now has a venture fund in Estonia, who told me that basically the startup ecosystem there has a sense of irrational patriotism. And that certainly is true in my experience. Like Estonian founders and VCs in the ecosystem do a ton to support one another, not just in Estonia, but also around the world. I mean, because now, they have Bolt, they have TransferWise, they have, I think, something like 10 unicorns, either from Estonian founders in Estonia or from Estonian founders who are in London or Silicon Valley. And so when Estonian, companies try and kind of build themselves up and need support or mentorship, they have that support from people who know folks and who have built multi-billion-dollar businesses now.
Absolutely. So you just described the rise of, I guess, how so many unicorns were created in such a small country. How does this startup environment intersect with the e-governance model of Estonia? Are these phenomenons related? How do they interact, in your opinion?
Yeah, there's a lot of back and forth between kind of the tech ecosystems, and I think this is partially intentional. So let me back up a little bit, and I'd say like a big part of why I think Estonia has been successful is that they created just the general policies that created a foundational, environment that enabled entrepreneurship and basically, strong rule of law, strong state capacity, all of these things that are necessary for having a place where you would build startups, where you would build companies, where you have kind of a high trust and yeah, and well-functioning society. And so when I talk about that, I mean you have you can talk about like the flat tax system and it being kind of a darling of foreign direct investment. That's one thing, but I'm more thinking about for instance the Tiger Leap campaign, which connected all the schools to the internet as well as had kind of a national education component to teach folks tech skills and really investing in developing the workforce of the future, which then paid off in spades a generation later as these kids kind of grew up. They either were more easily trained in becoming software engineers or were more technical minded, so it kind of set up an environment on the from the government side, preparing kind of the ground for this industry to succeed later, as well as uh, when you think about the government, in the e-government sector, they did a lot of work kind of collaborating with the private sector. And this is where it gets a little bit fuzzy because it's not exactly the startup community, but many of the same people are, kind of crossover. So there's kind of a whole ecosystem of e-government service providers like Digital Nation, which is from Sim Sikut, the former CIO of Estonia, as well as Nortal and Cybernetica that are somewhere in between startups and kind of consultancies. And so most of these companies, what the Estonian government did is they would contract them to build part of the e-government system. So whether this is like the i-voting or the electronic health records and kind of they would basically use the private sector to help build these in one way to build up the capacity of the private sector, but also so the government would serve as kind of this proof of concept customer. So then these companies could turn around and go to Benin or Colombia or somewhere in the Middle East and say like, hey, we've already built this for the world's most advanced digital society. I mean, and like this is where some of the branding stuff becomes really important. Like we can help you too, and the government does a lot to promote this. And I liken it to Estonia's take on the defense industry because if you think about the defense industry in the United States, the U.S. will go out to Turkey and our allies and around the world and basically say we'll sell you X arms or X weapons. But it's long-term commitments because if you sell someone a jet that lasts 30 years, you need to also sell maintenance and armaments and all these things. And if you think about this for e-government, you can help set up a code base, but like in general, if you go and basically help set up the digital infrastructure of a nation, you're creating a long-term government to government commitment that has much deeper ties than just a commercial transaction.
Absolutely. I mean, definitely a lot to unpack there. And I think maybe to sum up in short, so we have this education system that's producing, high quality software engineers, followed by a kind of an entrepreneurial ecosystem, along with capital that exists after the mid 2000s. Kind of creating this really forward thinking, both e-governance as well as unicorn creating country, a miracle as we describe in our community. And I guess, speaking of in terms of taking this e-governance model abroad. In another interview, you had mentioned cases like Namibia and South Africa. So these companies that would produce this e-governance infrastructure would also then go abroad. How do the receiving countries, I guess, interpret this? Do they see this as an inherently Estonian product? Do they associate like these private companies and like the Estonian idea as one and the same? And I guess what has been the success of these products in other places?
Yeah. My impression is that by and large, yes, they associate the companies with Estonia in a pretty significant way. And this is well, so I was just in Estonia and I was at the e-governance conference, which is literally, this focused of like, they were bringing in folks from around the world to talk about Estonia's e-government as well as e-government more broadly. There were folks from Ukraine, sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, literally from the entire world to talk about this. And indeed, it's the government will do delegations. They'll bring these e-government countries on kind of these diplomatic trips and help facilitate introductions. So there is quite a bit of blending in between what is public and private here. However, I mean the companies, the countries are doing business with the private sector by and large. However, there's even more gradients. There's, the e-governance academy, for instance, which is, I believe, a nonprofit partially funded by Estonia, and I want to say EU funds, but don't hold me to that. And many of their projects are funded by, the I think it's GIZ and like, basically foreign development institutions who want to support, maybe a priority country for them and developing digital infrastructure that will help with eliminating corruption or making the economy more sustainable, or whatever the kind of priority goals are. And they'll sometimes kind of fund these projects that the Estonian companies will then execute, right? So there definitely is a huge amount of crossover. And my impression is that the industry is doing quite well. I mean, I don't have super solid numbers. This is much more subjective, but my impression is that there's a lot of activity and a lot of interest from the rest of the world. And Estonia, in some way, has this unique benefit as it's not so big when you think about, if a country like the United States came to you as a smaller country and they wanted you to adopt, an e-government system and have a deep integration into government services, that might feel like a diplomatic pull that the country is like, well, now I'm allied directly with the United States, or now whereas like when it's with Estonia and I think basically all of the Baltics, they're small enough and non-threatening enough that none of them feel like if you go to South Africa and they say, yeah, my digital infrastructure was built by Estonia. I don't think, when they're doing a trade deal with China or the United States, I don't think anyone will have a problem with that or feel that, they're playing one side or the other, right? It's pretty, it's I mean, Estonia is in the EU, strong NATO member, I mean, really an exemplary one, but I think the global perception is that it's small enough that it's not, it's not kind of this global strategic risk.
Yeah, it doesn't come with any baggage because when you work with a great power, it comes perhaps with some expectations you might owe a favor down the line.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is a huge things we talk about in power competition. And I guess speaking in more abstract terms, you mentioned this interesting point about Estonia in a way leapfrogging the West in terms of jumping directly to modern systems, and you mentioned that like use and checks in banking didn't really exist in the country, which I found to be an interesting fact. Is that a model that kind of the developing nations that we just mentioned before can follow? And do those nations kind of see Estonia as an example that's attainable?
Yeah. Depending on the nation, depends on what they think is attainable. But let me give you a kind of counterexample that a country that I think has done this super, super well is Ukraine. Ukraine started their, e-government journey, really, really in earnest, maybe 10 years ago. And so, they have Prozoro, they have Dia, which is kind of the state within the smartphone. And because they had started a little while later than Estonia, whereas Estonia had really, I mean, we're talking like mid 90s and early 2000s principally for when Estonia is really developing the bulk of its e-government system. So naturally it's focused on desktop. I mean, I think iPhone is, '08, and then App Store doesn't get rolling until some years later. But for Ukraine, they built mobile first, right? And so I do think there is something to be said about understanding the technologies and kind of modalities that people are accessing, technology and services with at the time. And I think this is something that Ukraine did very well. I was playing with Dia last week. Yeah, sorry. Time is a bit fuzzy right now, flying back and forth. Uh and they do an excellent job on kind of the mobile interface and making it approachable on mobile. And so what I would say for this is one of the things I try to get across for folks who read the book is that you don't want to just copy Estonia wholesale and do exactly what they did. You want to basically, take the high level lessons and look at kind of the frameworks and the way they did things, and then adapt the technology and the cultural context of your time. So, for Ukraine, this meant, going kind of mobile first. For another country, that this might mean, a heavier integration with private sector providers. So, just for instance, in the United States, like, Apple and Google have such deep amounts of information about users, and they have such deep penetration on like biometrics. Like, plus they're already working with several states on basically digitizing your state level driver's license. Like, I could see them as fantastic providers for, a digital identity solution rather than the government having to build one wholesale. Whereas, if you go to Germany or something, it might just feel like, the cultural context might feel that you want to build from, a government system, because there might be less trust in the private sector, or might be, and especially in kind of like big tech companies that are by and large American, right?
And I guess you just gave two societal examples, and maybe before we kind of talk about societal trust, maybe we can kind of broaden the scope a bit and sort of go back to kind of what you describe as the third part of your book, as in looking to Estonia's country as a service ambition. Could you define this, I guess, concept for us, and kind of what does that look like in terms of these services provided? I know you mentioned a couple already.
Yeah. Yeah, so this idea of country as a service really came up from my old boss's boss, Tavi Kotka, who was the CIO of Estonia when I was working for their government. And it's basically this idea of like, if you think about, the government stack as in terms of like the services it provides. So for instance, you might think about defense, or personal safety, or the road system, or education, or healthcare. I mean, and different countries kind of provide different things, but in general, there's usually, there's rule of law, there's infrastructure, there's kind of these things. It's the idea of like breaking these apart, and thinking about how we would then provide them as a service to people, and kind of considering users as customers instead of, citizens that are kind of stuck, right? And part of this is functionally in part because of the way that technology is affecting the ways that we work today. So, for instance, with Skype, you had a multinational company that created billions of dollars in value in just a couple of years with a global user base. In the book, I use the example of WhatsApp, which I think sold for $19 billion with under 100 employees and from around the world. And so, you have the ability of individuals to make tremendous amounts of money, and the rise of remote work has shown that, like, for many people, and especially white collar and high paid jobs, you can really work from anywhere in the world if you want to. And so with this, I think it provided an opportunity for governments to think about how these services would appeal to other people. And so the program that I work for, e-Residency, was kind of the first idea, or the first concept that they tried to operationalize this, which is basically creating like the Delaware of Europe. So, for the United States, Delaware is basically like the de facto place everyone incorporates their business, right? Even if you're operating in California, you use a Delaware entity, because this is, where they have like a strong rule of law, court system, et cetera, et cetera. And it kind of builds on top of itself, because if everyone else goes there, you just go there too. Estonia is basically using e-Residency to try and do that for Europe. So if you're a company in Ukraine and you want to access the European market, you could either, you could hire a German tax lawyer to do all your documents in German, and you would have to physically fly to Berlin a bunch of times, right, to run a German entity. Or you could use e-Residency, remotely incorporate your business, do everything in English, and manage it digitally and remotely, by using the e-Residency program in Estonia. And so this is kind of this idea of taking something that was, a government service, although many times kind of like managed by the private sector, in terms of, I mean, because it was complicated, people use tax accountants and lawyers and whatever. But and basically creating a service provider and a government platform that did this. My other favorite example that unfortunately kind of didn't get off the ground due to COVID was, they have this program, Accelerate Estonia, which is like an incubator for government projects to develop. And one of the ones that was being worked on was allowing third country nationals to basically become part of Estonia's healthcare infrastructure, with the idea of making Estonia. So if you're a digital nomad, right, and you're not tied to a specific country's healthcare, or your job is, you're traveling all over the world, you don't have specific, a specific healthcare plan, you would basically make Estonia your home base. So if something happened, you would always have a, medical tourism destination that was safe and effective, and within the EU, with high medical quality standards, that you could go to and get medical treatment, right? So I do think there's a really interesting idea of kind of unbundling government services, and thinking, because you're unbundling them, thinking about the entire world as your potential customer, rather than just the people who happen to be born in your country.
And you mentioned, I guess, some of the success stories in terms of, services, government provide, and you just mentioned like even transnationally, which is something super interesting and makes us even question concepts about, political borders and entity and governance, which is super interesting. But I guess what have been some of the have there been specific projects that have struggled in terms of their implementation, or have any projects like failed to meet expectations, or is there ongoing services that have yet to meet expectations?
Yeah. Um, so one example I'd give you is that I so this is a little bit of a cop out, because I actually don't know if it failed to meet Estonians' expectations, but I think when I think in the US context of things like online voting, it's like this super exciting thing. If we had online voting, it would change the primary system, it would change how everything works in this country, yada yada. Estonia has had online voting for years and years. I think in the last election, 51% of people used online voting to cast their vote. But they actually don't have significantly higher youth participation rates than elsewhere in Europe. So to me, this kind of screams that, like, and if you talk to folks, it does make it somewhat more accessible, especially for people who are physically abroad, or elderly and infirm, or it just makes it slightly more convenient for folks. But it was kind of surprising to me that I would have thought, like, in isolation, if you said that, like, it only takes 5 minutes to vote in this country, I would have thought that, like, voting rates would dramatically go up. But that actually isn't the case when you look at the data. So I guess for Estonia, they might not consider this a loss, but or not a success. But I think for states and other countries looking at, like, e-government, it's a reminder that just making an e-service is not necessarily a panacea. There's lots of factors into why something is efficient or inefficient, or useful or not. And so just digitalizing a existing process or something doesn't necessarily mean that it will be dramatically better.
Do you see both AI applications in a military sense as well as e-governance as ways in which the West can maintain their, I guess, strategic advantage over adversaries? Like, is that like completely necessary in order to maintain some kind of, like strategic capabilities over like basic our geopolitical enemies?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so part of the reason I wrote the book is because after I worked in Estonia first, and then I came to the US and I started working in Congress. And part of my concern was that if we didn't become better in digital and AI as a government, and become more efficient and more, I mean, more efficient, as well as more yeah, able to navigate this digital world, and faster, just because the speed of decision making and the speed of technology. If you look at, like, the rates of adoption for various technologies to reach 100 million users, I mean, cell phones takes like decades, internet takes like a decade, and then AI, I think it took, for ChatGPT, I think it took a matter of weeks, or maybe a couple of months. And so the amount and the pace of change in consumer adoption, and the way it's affecting both individual lives as well as industry, are just incredibly fast. And so my concern was definitely that if the US and Western world didn't effectively adopt e-government technologies and AI, and kind of integrate them into their workflows, and change the way that the government operated, that we would have serious problems in kind of having a competitive governance framework, especially compared. I mean, much of my thinking is kind of great power rivalry with China in particular. But yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. One last question for me, and I'll turn to questions from the audience. And the audience is free to drop questions in the chat as you're go ahead done, or raise a virtual hand, and we'll certainly get to those questions. But you just mentioned the U.S. application of AI in terms of their governance models. We also heard from some diplomats in Estonia who say that Estonia has partnered at the state level with Oregon and Maryland, for example, in terms of sharing their digital expertise. Do you have any examples of collaborations between Estonia and the US, whether that's at the state, federal, or city level, that have led to successful e-government projects?
Yeah. Um, So I think it's shoot, I forget if it's cybernetic or a guard time, but I think they're working with Air Force Research Lab. So I had also sorry, it's been a little bit since I'd worked on this report, but I'd done a report on Estonia's defense tech ecosystem for the National Defense Industry Association, which is basically the big representative body for most of the American defense companies. And the cybernetic or guard time had worked with, I believe it was Air Force Research Lab, to develop a cyber information sharing arrangement. As many folks on the call are probably aware, Tallinn is home to NATO CCD-COE, the Cyber Center something of excellence, basically the hub for everything cyber capabilities. And so I think they kind of lead in developing this is somewhere in between defense and e-government, but like information sharing resources between the countries. And yeah, I've also heard about state level things. I think there's an AI Expo that has been going on the last couple of days in Washington D.C. And I know that a couple of Estonian companies were there chatting with potential customers, and so I think there's a lot of excitement at the state and the local levels, but I don't have a ton of good examples of their work.
It's absolutely no. I had saw the expo. And I think they were on a panel with the Taiwanese and the Ukrainians. So it's interesting how it's kind of falling in line geopolitically as well. But it's Washington, so that's to be
Yeah.
assumed. Um, I'll take Yorga's question in the chat, and then I'll go to Elmar, who has his hand raised. Yorga asks, how does the advance of AI will affect the creation of e-governance ecosystems?
Yeah. Um, my guess is that it probably speeds it up. I think there's going to be a lot more. If I just look at like the democratization of access to developing, new technologies. And so in the sense of like maybe you've heard of vibe coding. And so this is the idea of like, if you're a moderately good, actually it's not even moderately good. If you're a software engineer, you basically have a an AI buddy that's helping you write code. And so I think you can extrapolate this to the idea of like, whereas it might have taken, real, five developers many hours to build an internal system within BIS or whatever government agency. Now maybe a internal government engineer or maybe even like just a technically minded person can build their own tools. So we might not see from the outside a ton of change, but at least initially. But I could imagine a world where like a bunch of processes in the back office are getting automated relatively quickly. Of course, this is only if we let them. I think this is one of the issues with government is that quite often it's less of a knowledge issue and more of a process and management issue where we put a bunch of like checks and roadblocks in front of people and don't let civil servants exercise their autonomy and do what they think is best, which is in my mind a big loss. I'm a big believer that like civil servants are generally like highly patriotic and motivated and generally quite good. And so I'm a big fan of like letting them be more autonomous. But unfortunately, there isn't a ton of trust in government, so we're kind of in a weird catch-22 here.
Absolutely. So I'll go to Ilmar now, who's had his hand raised very patiently. So, Ilmar, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Joel. Wonderful of you to share so much insight and information with us. I sent you a connection request on LinkedIn and
Great.
hope that we can get to know each other on there. So I'm very familiar with the evolution of Estonia, especially the early days, because I was on the scene then. The very first delegation of Estonian business leaders ever to come to the United States, to New York City, was
Cool.
received by me personally and connected with top level counterparts on Wall Street and the New York City government and administration. The very first article ever written about Estonia's business climate by a major publication, Forbes magazine, was arranged by me. The very first largest privatization and from a U.S. investor in Estonia, the privatization of the Estonian shipping company, was arranged by me. And that was all in the mid to early 90s. So I can't help but be fascinated by how the ripple effects from those might have contributed in some small way to the buildup and subsequent evolution of the economy. So anyway, but my question to you is about your own personal journey. You mentioned having worked in Estonia prior to your work on Capitol Hill. I'm very interested to know, as a non-Estonian, obviously, unless you have hidden ancestry that we don't know about, what led you on your path and journey to Estonia? Did they find you or did you find them, and how?
Yeah, no Estonian ancestry. I was lucky enough to fall in love with the country very randomly. So I had started my career in tech in Silicon Valley. I was early at a YC and Andreessen backed startup and kind of help them scale up from I was the ninth employee to more than 100 and about 1,000 contractors as well. And then I went to Berlin to run a company for Rocket Internet, which is this kind of venture builder slash venture capital firm. So I was running basically a subsidiary entity for them, but I wanted to do something more impactful and meaningful. And I was on this I was just on random job sites, and I came across one called JBANC, which is an Estonian startup, and they did job sabbaticals. So 6 months in Bali and like very like kind of fun things. And I was like, oh, this is very cool. But I assumed to support an Estonian startup, the Estonian government was advertising some jobs with them, and there was one for a startup within the government, and I had never heard of such a thing. And I was like, well, I know startups, and like working for government seems impactful. So that seems cool. And so I applied, and I guess I was the only person who was willing to move to Tallinn in like, the depths of winter in, I think it was February of 2018. So they brought me on as head of business development for the e-Residency program. And so yeah, I admittedly, didn't know a ton about the country. I'd visited once for about 24 hours many years prior on a road trip. And I just like had vague recollections of the Tallinn Old Town being beautiful, but that was about it. And so, but then when I got there, I was just astounded by how far ahead they're, especially in the e-government side, they were. And then, I was coming from, Silicon Valley and then Berlin. And so, but I was also impressed with the tech scene. I mean, it felt like it didn't feel like that much of a culture shock, frankly, which is quite funny when you're, thousands of miles away.
Well, I'll just say if I had known we had such knowledgeable audience, I would have just quit my job at the start. So th thanks for the substantive question. And happy that you guys got connected in LinkedIn. As a DC creature, anytime you create a LinkedIn connection, it's like a new high. It's like you
Yes,
feel like you get some angelic points to DC heaven. So
absolutely.
uh, on that note, I'll let our colleague Heikki ask the question, and then if anyone else had a last question, feel free to drop it or raise your hand as we're coming to the end of the hour. So Heikki, please go ahead.
Greetings. While Estonia has been very successful in creating we're starting to see that other countries are starting to catch up and are releasing their own ambitious goals and plans. And with Estonia being such a small country, of course, do you expect that in the future Estonia will be able to continue its position as a leader in e-government and a
I think Heikki froze. Heikki, I think you froze, but I think your basic question was, do you like it was considering the size of Estonia, do you think it can continue being a leader in e-governance and what's the sustainability of the model? Uh, I think we can go with.
Yeah. So it's a great question. And indeed, I I mean, somewhat selfishly, well, as you can tell, I'm an American, and having also worked for our government, I mean, part of the reason I wrote the book is because I want America to improve and adopt Estonia's systems, and I would love if we leapfrogged Estonia and built even more modern systems, and did way more advanced stuff. But I would settle for us just copying Estonia's model and just being as advanced for them, and the billions and billions of dollars in savings and efficiency gains that would come along with it. I think you're absolutely right. If I look at, again, I had mentioned Ukraine, and so because they had started a little bit later, they were able to focus more on mobile, and kind of start with that, and they weren't saddled with kind of legacy software focused on the desktop, where they had to build for desktop and for mobile, which of course takes additional resources, right? So certainly, starting later in some scenarios does give you an opportunity to leapfrog. But that being said, I mean, Estonia has long, I mean, they just do so much work trying to be innovative. And it is funny because there's often, it seems like there's kind of 5-year cycles of people say, has Estonia lost its innovative spirit? Other places are catching up, and then they'll release some cool new thing, or they'll have a new strategy, and then after that they'll be like, oh, Estonia's way ahead again. And then a couple of years will go by, and the cycle kind of repeats. So I think it's somewhat natural for these innovation cycles, and actually, frankly, like, I hope the rest of the world catches up and takes on more of that. I mean, I think it's a massive win if, like, if all of a sudden the world gets better at more efficient government. Great.
And we'll have Estonian to thank for it. So, uh, I think with that being said, I know we're reaching the top of the hour, so I think that's a great note to conclude on. So, Joel, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate all the insights, and I hope everyone adds you on LinkedIn after this.
It was absolutely my pleasure. Really appreciate you having me.
Thank you for listening to Baltic Spotlight. To stay up to date on upcoming spotlights as well as advocacy opportunities, follow us on Instagram at JBANC Baltics, Twitter at JBANC Chatter, or email jbank@jbank.org.